Hi, I'm Rod Saunders from Jew and Greek. Well, my video last week on John MacArthur's comments about slavery really seemed to trigger some conversation. Most of the comments were positive, but a few fans of Johnny Mac came out to defend him. One person accused me of going after him because he's a Calvinist, but I would assume that most Calvinists deem slavery in any form other than a metaphor as unacceptable. I would have said the same things if a free will charismatic had said what he said. But you know what? In all my years as a charismatic, I've never come across any charismatic who would even suggest that slavery gets a bad rap. Another complaint was that I was taking him out of context, because he wasn't talking about chattel slavery, he was talking about indentured servitude, which was the most common form of slavery in the time of Christ. But he discussed the issue of slavery along with modern institutions like unions and a lack of opportunity due to a lack of education.
The reason unions grew up in America was because there were people who had businesses and they were abusing their employees. So to throw out slavery as a concept simply because there have been abuses, I think, is to miss the point. In any kind of human relationship, there can be abuses. There can also be benefits. For many people, poor people, perhaps people who weren't educated, perhaps people who had no other opportunity, working for a gentle, caring, loving master was the best of all possible worlds. If you had the right master, everything was taken care of.
So I would have to assume that he's including chattel slavery in the discussion. Even in the days of slavery in the United States, there were slave owners who treated their slaves humanely and actually made their lives better than what they would have experienced in Africa. MacArthur said that for somebody with no education, living with a good master was the best of all possible worlds. This reminds me of the expression, a bird in a gilded cage. No matter how nice your living arrangement is, nobody wants to be a slave. Man instinctively wants freedom, freedom of speech, freedom to travel, freedom to pursue wealth, freedom to choose where we live, what kind of work we do, how we worship. It's baffling to me how anybody could conceive of any form of slavery as the best of all possible worlds. So I decided to do a deeper dive into this topic. Let's start with his comment that we shouldn't have an aversion to slavery just because the concept of slavery has been misused.
It is a little strange that we have such an aversion to slavery because historically there have been abuses. You know, there have been abuses in marriage. We don't have an aversion to marriage particularly because there have been abuses. There are parents who abuse their children. We don't have an aversion to having children because some parents have been abusive. Of course, it can have any kind of situation where abuse can be involved.
So he compares slavery to marriage and family. But God sanctioned marriage and family. He joined Adam and Eve together and told them to be fruitful and multiply. Nowhere in the Bible did God say, "Behold, I give you fellow human beings as slaves. They're your property. Just be nice to them." Slavery was widespread in the ancient world in almost every culture. That being the case, Israel also had slaves. Some entered into servitude as prisoners of war. Others through a debt that they owed to somebody. For example, if your neighbor were to blame you for the death of his ox, he could take the matter before a judge, and if the judge agreed with him, he could rule that you owe your neighbor an ox. And if you couldn't come up with one, you could end up working off your debt to him as his slave. Or if you committed a crime that wasn't a capital offense, you could end up as a slave until you paid your debt to society. Today we have civil courts and criminal courts and prison systems to handle these matters. But the most common way that people became slaves was because of the nature of an economy that was based on agriculture in a patriarchal system that didn't provide career opportunities for women. If a woman's husband died and she had no male relative to provide for her, she could either become a beggar or offer her labor to a family in exchange for food, clothing, and shelter. It wasn't an ideal arrangement, but it beat starving. The same thing was true with orphans. With no orphanages, there weren't a lot of options for a kid without parents. If they were big and strong enough to work in the rock quarry, they could do that, but usually a better option was to be taken into someone's home as their servant. They wouldn't get any inheritance as the family members would, but again, it was better than starving. This is what Paul was referring to when he said that we are no longer slaves, but sons and heirs in Galatians 4:7. We as believers have an inheritance both in this world and the world to come. This was an analogy that people in that day could comprehend because of the common practice of slavery. But nowhere in the Bible are we told that God sanctioned slavery. It's just the way that things were, and God allowed for it because it at least provided people with the necessities of life. So for John MacArthur to suggest that there's some equivalency with the institution of the family and the institution of slavery is mind-blowing.
So we have to go back and take a more honest look at slavery and understand that God has, in a sense, legitimized it when it's handled correctly by saying this is the way you're to view your relationship to Jesus Christ.
So he says that God has, in a sense, legitimized slavery because when it's handled correctly, it could be beneficial to the slave. This reminds me of the idealistic view that many people have about socialism, that if it were to be implemented correctly, it would be beneficial to everybody. But the problem with socialism isn't the implementation. The problem is that it's fundamentally flawed because human nature being what it is, people need incentive to produce. And socialism doesn't allow for people to own property and accumulate wealth unless they're part of the government. Likewise, the problem with slavery isn't the implementation. It's the fact that it's based on the assumption that it's okay for one human being created in God's image to own another human being created in God's image. That assumption is wrong, which is why today slavery has been outlawed around the globe. Even indentured servitude, which was abolished in the United States in 1917, is nearly globally abolished. MacArthur then goes on to discuss the analogy of slavery to our relationship with Christ.
If you tell me that my master will use me in the advancement of his own enterprises and that I will share in his reward, if you tell me that my master will make me as a son and give me all that he possesses as an heir of his own true son, if you tell me that my master will forgive all my sins and reward me forever, I can't sign up fast enough to be a slave of that master. And that is the issue. Slavery is not objectionable if you have the right master. It's the perfect scenario.
Now, as I said in the last video, I don't think people have a problem with the metaphor of slavery, as in Christ has purchased our salvation and we are his bondservants. But let's remember that the Apostle Paul also said that we as believers are the Lord's freedmen. Were you called while a slave? Do not be concerned about it. But if you can be made free, rather use it. For he who is called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's freedman. Likewise, he who is called while free is Christ's slave. You were bought at a price. Do not become slaves of men. 1 Corinthians 7:21-23. Now, when he said don't become the slaves of men, he was referring to circumcision. Don't fall back into the law and the legalism promoted by the Judaizers. But at the same time, Paul is saying that the idea of being another man's slave is bad. So I don't see how any minister of the gospel can read the Bible and come away believing that slavery is a good idea, or that it's sanctioned somehow by God. The thought that a fallen human being should be able to own a fellow human being is abhorrent to any civilized person. And for a minister of the gospel to even suggest that just stigmatizes Christians as primitive thinking dimwits. In his 2013 Strange Fire conference, MacArthur provided videos of charismatics getting out of control, along with commentary about how terrible it is that the world sees this behavior and concludes that Christians are fools. Well, how do you think the world will react to MacArthur saying that we need to reconsider how we view slavery? My guess is that while they might laugh at the extremism from some charismatics, they'll be horrified at the comments of John MacArthur on slavery. So how about we all try to do better? Thanks for watching, and be blessed.